spoken in a calm, cold, whispering tone. Welcome back to Daily Horror. Tonight, we're going somewhere the cold gets into your bones. To the immense, silent landscapes of Alaska, where towns once thrived, and now there is nothing. The horror we are exploring is not simply of a spirit, but of geography itself. It's the unique, suffocating terror of realizing you are days from help, with no signal, no roads, and the thing you are seeing is impossible. It is the fear of having absolutely nowhere to escape. I need to be clear. The accounts you are about to hear are not urban legends or internet fiction. They are direct testimonials from the individuals who experienced them, all within the last year. These are professionals, a mine inspector, a photographer, a teacher, whose work brought them to these forgotten sites. We've cross-checked what we could against work orders and sparse police records. These are the documented moments when rational people came face to face with a world that defies reason, where the past is not dead, merely waiting. If you feel you must know what else is hidden in these forgotten places, subscribe. Join us in the dark. Let us know in the comments if you've ever been somewhere that felt occupied by its own history. Our first account comes from a man sent to document the decay of a gold rush town named Solitude Creek, a place that had been empty for 90 years. He set up his camera as the Arctic twilight began, believing he was completely alone. You learn a few hard truths after 6 years of crawling through the guts of Alaska's dead mines. The first is that rock and timber hold memories. The second is that some darkness is absolute, a physical weight on your shoulders. But the most important rule, the one I forgot that night, is that you never, ever assume you're alone. My name is Jake Morrison, and my job is to walk into the black mouths of mountains and make sure they don't swallow anyone else. I'm a state mine safety inspector, and I've seen it all: gas pockets that can kill you in a single breath, collapsed tunnels waiting to entomb the unwary, and enough rust and decay to make you believe time itself is a predator. But nothing prepared me for the call I got in late October of 2023. My supervisor's voice was tight over the phone. Reports were trickling in from the area around the old Kennecott copper mine. Chatter about phantom lanterns and the clang of tools echoing from the abandoned shafts. The local sheriff, tired of spooked tourists and worried locals, wanted an official all-clear before the first big snow sealed the place off for the winter. Kennecott is practically Alaskan royalty, a ghost town perched in the Wrangell Mountains, a 5-hour drive and a world away from Anchorage. It was a titan from 1911 to 1938, disgorging a fortune in copper before the veins ran dry and the company vanished, leaving the entire town flash-frozen in the past. I'd done routine daylight checks there before, but these new reports were different. The phenomena were exclusively nocturnal, happening between the witching hours of midnight and 3 in the morning. A nighttime inspection was the only way. My boss partnered me with Marcus Chen, a geologist barely a year out of university, whose eagerness was practically a physical force. He was brilliant, but all his knowledge came from textbooks, not from the gut-deep feeling you get when 100,000 tons of mountain are breathing down your neck. In hindsight, I should have pulled rank and gone by myself. We rolled into Kennecott as the clock ticked past 11, our truck groaning over a dirt track that hadn't felt a grader's blade since World War II. The ghost town was a skeleton at the foot of colossal, snow-dusted peaks. Even under a brilliant full moon, the mountains didn't just cast shadows. They devoured the light, drowning the skeletal mill, the boarded-up hospital, and the silent rows of workers' cabins in an ocean of ink. We parked and started gearing up in the frigid air. Our kit was standard but robust. Multi-gas detectors, laser measurement tools for structural analysis, and LED floodlights that could turn night into day. Marcus was a bundle of nerves, his hands fluttering as he double and triple-checked every latch and battery. He'd read the official incident reports, and his overactive imagination was painting horrors on the back of his eyelids. I clapped him on the shoulder, offering a lame reassurance. Probably just a loose transformer arcing in the wind, or maybe a moose got stuck in the powerhouse. We'll be in and out. The main entrance to the Kennecott mine is a gaping wound in the mountainside, a portal to a sprawling network of tunnels. The operation had been state-of-the-art for its day, a subterranean city with electric trams and industrial-scale ventilation. We stepped across the threshold at exactly midnight, and the world dissolved. Our headlamps bored twin holes in a blackness so profound it felt solid. The temperature plunged to a steady 38 degrees, our breath pluming in the beams. Every footstep was an explosion of sound, echoing off the weeping rock walls as we pushed deeper, following the main artery of the mine. About 300 yards in, we arrived at what used to be a shift change chamber, a wide cavern where tunnels spiderwebbed off into the mountain's core. I was calibrating my gas detector when Marcus's hand shot out and clamped onto my arm. "Did you hear that?" he hissed, his voice a dry whisper. I froze, straining my ears past the thumping of my own heart. There was the familiar mine symphony, the distant plink-plunk of dripping water, the low groan of ancient support timbers settling, the faint sigh of air moving through a forgotten shaft. But then, underneath it all, I caught it, a rhythmic, metallic beat. Clang, pause, clang. It was coming from deeper inside, a sound with purpose. "Thermal contraction," I said, the words feeling thin and hollow. "The temperature swings make the old steel beams sing. Happens all the time." But I didn't believe it. The sound was too steady, too deliberate. It was the rhythm of work, of a hammer striking a chisel, of a pickaxe meeting rock. We exchanged a look, and an unspoken agreement passed between us. We had to know. The sound guided us down a narrow, auxiliary tunnel I'd never seen on any of my previous surveys. The walls here weren't blasted smooth but were rough-hewn, scarred with the marks of hand tools. This was old work. The support beams looked like gnarled, petrified bones, but my scanner confirmed they were, impossibly, still solid. As we crept forward, the clanging grew louder, sharper. And now a new sound bled through. Voices. A low, guttural murmur, like a conversation heard through a thick wall. Marcus stopped dead, his eyes wide in the reflection of my headlamp. "Jake, there are people down here." My first thought was trespassers. Scrappers, maybe, or reckless urban explorers. But the closer we got, the more wrong it felt. The language they spoke was like nothing I'd ever heard. A string of hollow, resonant sounds that seemed to echo from a great distance. We rounded a final, sharp bend and the tunnel opened into a vast, cathedral-like stope. And we stopped, paralyzed. The chamber was alive with light. Not the harsh, clean light of our LEDs, but the soft, dancing golden glow of dozens of oil lamps and carbide lanterns, casting a web of writhing shadows. And in that light moved the silhouettes of men. They were working, a full-scale mining operation, right there in the heart of a mountain that had been declared dead for 85 years. The clanging was the sound of their shovels and picks against the rock face. The murmuring was their chatter as they loaded or carts and shored up timbers. I just stood there, my brain refusing to connect the signals from my eyes. This had to be a prank, an unbelievably elaborate one. But the scene was warped, like a dream on the verge of becoming a nightmare. The light from their lanterns seemed to bleed at the edges, and the shadows they cast moved with a life of their own. The miners themselves, they were like projections on smoke, their forms wavering with the slightest draft, solid one moment and ethereal the next. Marcus was now gripping my arm so hard I could feel each of his knuckles through my thick coat, his body trembling. I fumbled for my radio, my lifeline, and keyed the mic. A blast of static, laced with a faint, melodic whisper of that same impossible language, was all that came back. Something was jamming the signal. Then one of the figures near the center of the chamber paused, straightened his back, and turned toward us. In the flickering lamplight, I saw his face. He was in his 40s, with a heavy, drooping mustache and eyes that didn't reflect light but seemed to generate their own, like distant coals. He wore the uniform of a bygone era. Heavy canvas trousers, a dark wool shirt, and a battered cap with a small carbide lamp clipped to the brim. The most terrifying part? I could see the rock wall of the chamber straight through his chest. He was a ghost made of memory and mist. He looked right at me, not at my light, but at me, and a slow smile spread across his face. He raised a semi-transparent hand in a gesture that could have been a wave or a warning. Then he turned, and with a fluid, mechanical motion, swung his pickaxe back into the rock. I don't know how long we stood there, two men from the future watching an impossible past. Time had come unglued. Felt like 10 minutes, it felt like a lifetime. Finally, Marcus's terrified tug on my sleeve broke the spell. His eyes screamed what his mouth couldn't. Get out, now. We backed away, step by agonizing step, trying to make no sound, trying to become invisible. Once we were back in the narrow side tunnel, we didn't walk. We ran. A frantic, stumbling retreat through the suffocating darkness, the sounds of the phantom mine fading behind us. When we burst out of the mine entrance, gasping the clean, painfully cold air, the first hints of dawn were painting the eastern peaks in shades of violet and gray. My watch said it was just after 6 in the morning. We had been underground for 6 hours. We packed the truck in a stupor, the silence between us a living thing. The drive back to Anchorage was a blur. It wasn't until we were back in the fluorescent-lit safety of the office that Marcus, looking pale and 10 years older, finally spoke. What did we see, Jake? I gave him the only answer I had. I don't know. I filed my report. Routine nocturnal inspection of Kennecott Mine. No anomalous geological or structural findings. Site secure. Writing those words felt like a betrayal, a lie of monumental proportions. But how could I report the truth? I became obsessed, spending my nights digging through archives, poring over brittle, yellowed documents from the Kennecott Mining Company. What I found chilled me more than the ghostly smile. Between 1911 and 1938, at least 37 men died in that mine. Cave-ins, explosions, falls, machinery failures. Their names were listed, often with a stark, one-line explanation. Many were buried in unmarked graves right there on the mountainside, their families too poor to bring them home. We hadn't just seen ghosts. We had stumbled upon the midnight shift that never clocked out. They are still there, bound to the rock, eternally digging for copper that isn't there, trapped in a loop of their final moments. I've never been back to Kennecott. Marcus put in for a transfer 6 months later and now works exclusively on surface-level surveys. We never speak of it, but sometimes, across the quiet office, our eyes meet. I see the same ghost in his stare that I see in my own reflection. The reports of lights and sounds from Kennecott still come in every year, always from the deep of night, always dismissed as wind or wildlife. But I know better. Deep in the cold heart of that mountain, the midnight shift is still hard at work. Have you ever held something that felt like it was holding a secret? Not just old, but waiting. I'm a treasure hunter, but I don't search for gold or jewels. I search for the stories left behind in the forgotten corners of Alaska. For 8 years, my shop in Anchorage, Forgotten Alaska, has been my life, a place where dusty relics from the frontier get a second chance. But some treasures, I've learned, aren't meant to be found. The real prize in my line of work is always the impossible find, like perfectly preserved women's clothing from the gold rush. So when a fellow dealer whispered about an untouched general store in Defies, a ghost town swallowed by the wilderness near Skagway, my heart started pounding. Defies was a meteor, a boomtown that flared to life in the 1890s as the gateway to the Chilkoot Pass, only to be extinguished almost overnight when the railroad chose Skagway instead. The story was that the last owner of the store had simply locked the door and walked away, leaving it a perfect time capsule from 1900. Getting there was a pilgrimage. I pushed my truck to its limits on an old mining trail that was more rock than road, the mountains pressing in on all sides. When I finally reached the valley, the silence was absolute. Defies was a skeleton, just foundations and the ghostly framework of a pier reaching into the Lynn Canal. But there it was, just as the tip had promised. A 2-story wooden building, weathered but defiantly whole. The front padlock was a lump of rust, but around back, a loose board gave way. The second I squeezed inside, the air changed. It was thick with the ghosts of old scents, wood smoke, cured leather, and something else, something faintly sweet like dried tobacco. Dust motes danced like fairies in the slivers of light cutting through the grimy windows. The ground floor was stripped bare for the most part, but upstairs was a different world. It was the proprietor's living quarters, frozen in time. It was as if the family had just stepped out for a moment, leaving behind their furniture, their books, even photographs on the wall. This was the jackpot every antique dealer dreams of. I spent hours just documenting, my camera clicking in the heavy silence. A dining set worth a small fortune, a few original oil paintings. But then I opened a heavy wooden armoire. Tucked behind some heavy wool coats was a flash of white. I carefully pushed the other garments aside and my breath caught in my throat. It was a wedding dress, and it was the most exquisite thing I had ever seen. A cascade of ivory silk, shimmering with beadwork so fine it looked like captured starlight. The style was pure 1890s, with a high collar and a train long enough to grace a cathedral aisle. But the impossible part was its condition. After more than a century in a building without heat, exposed to Alaska's brutal temperature swings, it should have been yellowed, brittle, or eaten by moths. Instead, it looked like it had been finished yesterday. The silk felt soft and supple under my fingers. As I lifted it from the armoire, it felt impossibly light, almost weightless. Holding it up to the weak light, I could have sworn the lace on the hem shivered, a tiny, subtle ripple, but the air in the room was completely still. I told myself it was just a trick of the eye. A dress like this, in this condition, could fetch over $20,000. I wrapped it with the reverence of a museum curator and began the long journey home. The drive back to Anchorage was different. Usually, a find like this fills me with a giddy excitement, a thrill of victory. This time, I felt a strange, solemn sense of responsibility, as if I were a guardian, not a seller. Back in my workshop, under the professional glow of my photography lamps, the dress seemed to glow with a life of its own. I set up my camera to take detailed shots for my inventory. I was focusing on the intricate beating of the train when I saw her. Through the camera's viewfinder, a shape resolved in the background. It was a young woman, her dark hair piled in an elegant 1890s style, her eyes large and sorrowful. She was looking directly at me, through the lens. I dropped the camera, my heart hammering against my ribs. I stared at the spot behind the dress. Nothing, just the blank wall of my workshop. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation, a reflection, a trick of the light. Shaking, I raised the camera again. She was still there, and this time her translucent hand was reaching out, her fingers just inches from the silk. That was only the beginning. Over the next few days, she was a constant, unnerving presence. A fleeting glimpse in the reflection of a window, a shadowy figure at the edge of my vision. The dress itself seemed to be waking up. I'd leave it draped on a mannequin one way, only to find it subtly rearranged in the morning. Once, when I touched the sleeve, the silk felt warm, as if it held the residual heat of a living body. I started digging into Dai's history, desperate for an answer. I found them in dusty municipal records, the Patterson family, Thomas and Margaret, and their 19-year-old daughter, Sarah. She had come to Alaska in 1897, engaged to a prospector named William Hayes. They were to be married in the spring of 1899. But the wedding never happened. William was killed in an avalanche on the pass that March. The records showed that Sarah, heartbroken, succumbed to pneumonia later that same brutal winter. Her parents, devastated, abandoned Dai and everything in it the following summer. The dress was Sarah's. It had waited in that armoire unworn for over 120 years. The knowledge made everything worse. The activity in the workshop grew more intense, more personal. I'd find old family photos from my own collection placed near the dress. One night, I could have sworn I heard the soft, choked sound of weeping coming from the corner where it was draped. The end came 3 weeks after I brought it home. It was nearly midnight, and I was trying to force myself to finish the paperwork to sell it to a collector. A sound drifted from the workshop, a faint, tinkling melody, like a distant music box. I crept to the door and peered inside. My blood ran cold. The dress was floating in the center of the room, hovering 3 feet off the floor. It swayed gently, as if worn by an invisible dancer. Then, the air shimmered, and Sarah Patterson became visible, a beautiful, translucent figure wearing her gown at last. She waltzed slowly, her expression one of infinite sadness. She saw me. The dance stopped. Her ghostly eyes met mine, and when she spoke, her voice was a whisper carried across a century. "I never got to wear it," she said, her voice breaking with an eternity of sorrow. "I never got to dance at my wedding. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe," as I watched Sarah Patterson finally have her dance. After a few timeless moments, her form began to fade, and the dress drifted down, settling silently onto my workbench. The next morning, I packed the dress back into its box. I drove all the way back to Dai, the journey a solemn, silent pilgrimage. I squeezed back into the general store, climbed the stairs, and placed the dress back in the armoire, arranging it just as I had found it. As I stepped out of the building and back into the Alaskan air, I heard it, or maybe I just felt it, a faint, feminine whisper on the wind. "Thank you. Some things aren't meant to be bought or sold. Some stories are meant to stay in the quiet, forgotten places where they were born." The dress is still there, I'm sure of it, waiting in the dark. And sometimes, when the wind blows just right through the ruins of Dai, they say you can still hear the faint sound of waltz music, as a bride finally gets the dance she was denied so long ago. Have you ever heard a sound that simply shouldn't exist? A noise so out of place, so fundamentally impossible, that your brain refuses to process it? That's what I want to talk about, because I heard a sound like that once, and it changed everything I thought I knew about the world. My name is Marcus, and trains are in my blood. My grandfather spent nearly 4 decades as a conductor on the Alaska Railroad, weaving through landscapes that were equal parts breathtaking and lethal. While I never followed him into the profession, his stories ignited a fire in me. I became a sort of railroad archaeologist, dedicating my free time to hunting down the ghosts of Alaska's abandoned lines, collecting artifacts, and poring over historical maps. It was this obsession that led me to McCarthy in the fall of 2023. McCarthy is a speck on the map, the last stop on what was once the Copper River and Northwestern Railway. Built in the early 1900s, this line was an engineering marvel, a steel artery created for one purpose: to bleed the rich copper ore from the Kennecott mines down to the port of Cordova. But when the mines dried up in 1938, the railroad died with them. Almost 200 miles of track, bridges, and tunnels were left to be swallowed by the unforgiving Alaskan wilderness. I'd been dreaming of this trip for months. My goal was to photograph the skeletal remains of the old trestles before the first heavy snows made the area inaccessible. The journey there was a trial in itself. The McCarthy Road, a 60-mile stretch of gravel that loosely follows the old railbed, is a brutal gauntlet of potholes and narrow bridges that feels designed to shake your vehicle and your courage to pieces. By the time I arrived on a bleak Thursday afternoon, I felt like I'd already traveled back in time. The town itself is home to maybe 24 year-round souls. I was staying at a little bed and breakfast run by a woman named Rose Delano, a true Alaskan elder in her 70s with kind eyes and hands that told a story of a long, hard life. Her family had been in McCarthy since the boom days, and she was delighted to find her guest was a railroad fanatic. That evening, sitting in her cozy kitchen, she painted a picture of the past. "My father was a section foreman for the railway," she told me, her voice raspy over the steam from our coffee mugs. "He always said that line was built less with engineering and more with sheer, stubborn will." She cautioned me about exploring alone, especially with the short October days and the notoriously fickle weather. But she saw the gleam in my eye, the same passion that probably drove her father, and she loaned me a hand-drawn map marking the most intact sections of the old right-of-way. The next morning, I was off, my pack filled with camera gear and enough food for the day. My destination was a 3-mile hike out of town, to a spot where the railroad had once spanned a massive gorge on a timber trestle. My research suggested that a significant portion of the bridge, a ghost of its former glory, was still standing. The trail was faint, the forest floor a thick carpet of fallen leaves. It was clear no one had come this way in a long time. Yet, I could still see the scars the railroad had left on the land, the graded earth, the drainage cuts, a century-old testament to the men who had fought this wilderness and, for a time, won. I found the bridge just after noon, and it stopped me in my tracks. Even in its ruinous state, It was magnificent. A skeleton of massive timber beams, some as thick as a man's torso, jutted out over the chasm. Roughly half of it remained, ending abruptly in midair. Far below, in the rocky throat of the gorge, lay the splintered remains of the collapsed section. I spent hours there, completely absorbed, photographing every joint and rusted bolt, trying to capture the soul of this decaying giant. The only sounds were the sigh of the wind through the pines and the occasional cry of a raven. It was perfect. As the sun began to bleed toward the horizon, casting long, cold shadows, I started to pack up. I wanted to be well on my way before darkness fell completely. And that's when I heard it. A deep, rhythmic pulse from somewhere in the woods. Thump thump, thump thump. At first, I dismissed it. A distant generator, maybe? But the sound was too methodical, too organic. It sounded like the heavy chuffing of a steam engine straining against a heavy load. I froze, listening, trying to pinpoint the source. It grew louder, more defined, and an icy dread trickled down my spine. The sound was coming from the abandoned rail line. Not just near it, but on it. It was as if a train was steaming its way toward the very bridge where I stood. Then other sounds layered in, the unmistakable click-clack of wheels on steel rails, the high-pitched squeal of brakes, and then a sound that made my blood run cold. The sharp, mournful blast of a steam whistle echoing off the mountains. My logical mind screamed that this was impossible. The tracks were gone, torn up for scrap decades ago. The bridge was a death trap. There was no train. There couldn't be. But my ears told a different story. The noise was now a symphony of industrial power, the laborious breath of the locomotive, the clanking of cars, and even, I thought, the faint shouts of men. Instinct took over. I grabbed my camera and scrambled to a vantage point with a clear view of the bridge approach. Just as I got into position, a single, brilliant headlight sliced through the twilight, moving steadily along the phantom track bed. Behind it, a dark, hulking shape took form against the darkening sky. A steam locomotive, its smokestack belching ghostly plumes. It was pulling a long string of cars, impossibly loaded. My hands trembled so violently I could barely hold the camera steady, but I started shooting. Through the lens, I saw impossible details. It was an old narrow-gauge engine, painted in the historic dark green of the Copper River and Northwestern Railway. I could make out silhouettes in the cab, men in old-fashioned work clothes, moving with purpose. The train didn't slow as it neared the broken trestle. It just kept coming. I tried to scream, to wave, to warn them of the chasm ahead, but my throat was locked in terror. And then, the moment that shattered my reality. Instead of plummeting into the gorge, the locomotive glided out over the abyss. It crossed the 100-foot gap, its wheels turning on rails of memory, supported by nothing but the cold mountain air. I watched, breathless, as the entire train, engine, tender, and a dozen cars, floated across the void and vanished into the forest on the other side. The chuffing and clanking faded, until once again, the only sound was the wind. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the empty space where a train had just been. I fumbled with my camera, scrolling back through the photos. Nothing. Every single image showed nothing but the broken bridge against an empty twilight sky. My camera had captured the truth of the present, but not the truth of the moment. The 3-mile hike back to town was the longest of my life. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sent a jolt of fear through me. When I stumbled back into Rose's kitchen, I must have looked like I'd seen a ghost. She took one look at my pale face and trembling hands, sat me down, and poured a cup of coffee that was nearly black. I recounted the entire experience, my voice shaking. She listened patiently, her expression unreadable, showing no shock or disbelief. When I finished, she was silent for a long time, just stirring her coffee. "So, you saw it then," she finally said, her voice soft. "You're not the first. My father saw that train 3 times in all his years on the line. Always in the evening. Always at that bridge." She said he called it the ghost run, the spirits of the crewmen still trying to get their load to Cordova. She walked over to an old wooden cabinet and carefully retrieved a brittle, yellowed newspaper clipping dated 1923. The headline read, "Train Derailment Claims 6 Lives Near McCarthy." The article described how a locomotive and 4 cars had gone off that very trestle during a freak blizzard. The entire crew was lost, their bodies never recovered, claimed by the gorge. "Every few years, someone sees them," Rose continued, her gaze distant. "Always the same train on the same run. My father believed they'll keep running until someone finally fixes that bridge and lets them finish their journey." I left McCarthy the next day, my research trip cut short. I haven't been back. But sometimes, late at night, when I hear the low whistle of a modern freight train in the distance, my mind goes back to that evening in the Alaskan wilderness. I think of those phantom railroaders, eternally bound to their impossible task. My photos show only a broken bridge in a lonely gorge, but I know what I saw. Somewhere out there, in the vast, silent forests of Alaska, the last train is still running, forever chasing a destination they can never reach. Have you ever heard a sound that simply shouldn't exist? A sound so out of place, so impossible, that it makes the hairs on your arm stand up before your brain can even process it? I have, and it happened in a place called Chitina, Alaska, inside a schoolhouse that had been sealed shut for decades. My name is Emma Thompson. I'm 26, and for the last 4 years, my life has been a series of journeys into the most remote corners of Alaska as a substitute teacher. It's a job that's as rewarding as it is tough, bringing education to kids in places most people only see on maps. Usually, I'm greeted by bustling communities and schools filled with bright, eager faces. But sometimes, my work leads me to the ghosts of towns past, places left behind by shifting economies and dwindling populations. Chitina is one of those ghosts. It was once a bustling hub for the railroad, home to more than 1,000 souls. Now, fewer than 50 people live there year-round, mostly older folks or those catering to the handful of tourists who brave the roads in summer. I arrived in late September of 2023, not to teach, but to do research for my master's thesis on rural Alaskan education. The town's old school, a relic from 1915, was the centerpiece of my project, a perfect specimen of frontier architecture built for learning. The town council had granted me full access, asking only that I share my findings with their local historical society. The schoolhouse itself stands on a low hill, watching over the skeletal remains of Chitina's main street. It's a 2-story wooden giant, its tall windows designed to drink in every last drop of sunlight during the long, oppressive Alaskan winters. It had served the town from 1915 right up until 1987, when there simply weren't enough children left, and the remaining students were sent to a consolidated school in Glen Ellen. Since that day, it had been locked, abandoned to the mercy of the brutal climate. I rolled into Chitina on a grim, gray afternoon that promised a cold rain. The 70-mile gravel road leading from the highway felt like a journey back in time, and the town itself was hushed and desolate. The few residents I saw gave me friendly nods, but their eyes held a flicker of surprise. Why would anyone be interested in the derelict school? The caretaker, a man in his 70s named Robert Steinberg, was a living piece of that history. He'd been a student there in the 60s and was on the school board when they made the heartbreaking decision to close it. His hands were gnarled from a life of hard work, and his eyes held the quiet weight of a long, hard life. He seemed genuinely thrilled that the school story would be preserved and spent the better part of an hour telling me tales of the teachers and students who had filled its halls. "That building holds more than just memories," he said, his voice like gravel rolling downhill as he handed me a heavy, ornate key. "It holds echoes, some good, some not. Those winters, they were hard on everyone, especially the kids who had to trek miles through the snow. We lost a few over the years to sickness and accidents. But the school was the heart of this town, right until the heart just stopped beating." He warned me the electricity had been cut decades ago, so I'd need my own lights. He also advised me to be cautious on the second floor, mentioning that some of the floorboards were probably rotten. With his words echoing in my mind, I thanked him and made my way up the hill. The front door groaned in protest as I turned the key, the sound echoing like a mournful cry through the cavernous, silent building. The air inside was a physical presence. A thick, heavy perfume of decay, ancient paper, and chalk dust that had settled for 36 years. The ground floor held 2 large classrooms and a small office for the principal. It was a perfect time capsule. Desks still sat in neat rows, their wooden surfaces scarred with the ghosts of forgotten initials. Faded educational posters clung to the walls, their colors muted but their lessons still visible. In one room, a vintage globe from the 1950s displayed a world of forgotten borders and countries, like the USSR and Yugoslavia. In the other, a piano sat silently in a corner, its keys yellowed like old teeth. A few of its strings snapped and curling outwards. I spent hours documenting everything, the light from my portable lamps cutting sharp angles through the dusty air. The place felt sacred, a monument to the resilience of the children who had learned their ABCs in one of the world's most unforgiving environments. As daylight began to fade, I decided to venture upstairs. Robert's warning was fresh in my mind, but as I tested each step of the narrow staircase, I found the structure to be surprisingly solid. The second floor was a single, vast space, an auditorium with a small stage at one end and rows of wooden benches. It was here, while I was photographing the stage, that I heard it for the first time. The school bell. There was no mistaking the sound. A deep, resonant clang that vibrated not just in my ears, but straight through the floorboards into the soles of my feet. It rang with the steady, measured pace that once called children to their lessons. But it was impossible. Robert had told me the bell itself was removed when the school closed, donated to a museum in Anchorage. I scanned the empty bell tower outside the window. It was a hollow mouth against the gray sky. I tried to rationalize it. An acoustic trick, the wind howling through the empty tower just right. Then it rang again. This time, the pattern was different. 3 sharp, quick rings, followed by 2 long, drawn-out ones. The signal for the end of the day. A rhythm that had marked the passage of time here for 72 years. The third time the bell rang, it wasn't alone. It was joined by a sudden symphony of life from the floor below. The scrape and shuffle of dozens of small chairs on a wooden floor. The rustle of paper. And then, the unmistakable sound of children's voices, high and bubbling with the excitement that only the end of a school day can bring. My heart hammered against my ribs. Moving with a stealth I didn't know I possessed, I crept back down the stairs. The sounds grew clearer as I descended. The chatter of children, their words occasionally floating out of the general murmur. Homework. Recess. Miss Anderson. I reached the hallway and peered cautiously around the frame of the first classroom door. My brain screamed at me that it was a trick of the light, a hallucination brought on by the dust and the isolation. But my eyes refused to listen. The room was alive. It was filled with at least 20 children, their ages ranging from 6 to maybe 14. They were dressed in clothes from another era, simple wool dresses on the girls, knickers and suspenders on the boys. At the front of the room, a woman in her 30s stood writing on the blackboard, her long skirt and prim white blouse straight out of the 1950s. Her script was a perfect, looping cursive, the kind of penmanship that has become a lost art. They looked so solid, so real. They were packing up their books, pulling on heavy coats, laughing and talking with their friends. But something was profoundly, terrifyingly wrong. It took me a full minute to place the chilling detail that made the scene so nightmarish. None of them cast a shadow. The late afternoon sun streamed through the windows, illuminating the dust in the air. But the children and their teacher were like holes in reality, absorbing the light without reflecting a single silhouette. Just then, the teacher at the front turned from the board, and her eyes met mine. They were kind eyes, and she had a gentle, warm smile. Her voice, when she spoke, was clear and projected perfectly. A teacher's voice. "Class is dismissed for today," she said, her gaze fixed entirely on me, not on the students. "Remember to finish your arithmetic problems and please bundle up. Winter is coming early this year." The children began to file out, passing just inches from where I stood frozen in the hallway. A wave of intense cold washed over me with each child that passed, a personal pocket of winter that moved with them. A few of the younger ones glanced up at me, their expressions curious but not alarmed. One little girl with blonde braids and a bright red coat stopped and tugged on the sleeve of my jacket. Her touch was colder than ice. I looked down into her smiling face, and she spoke in a voice that seemed to whisper from a great distance. "Are you our new teacher?" she asked. "Miss Anderson has been hoping someone would come. There are so many of us now. We all want to learn." Before I could find my voice, she turned and skipped away, her little red coat a splash of color disappearing with the others out the front door. I followed them outside and watched as they scattered down the hill, their small figures heading towards homes that no longer existed. The teacher, Miss Anderson, was the last to leave. She paused beside me on the school's front steps, looking out at the ruined town. "We have been waiting for so long," she said, her voice a soft, sad murmur. "The children miss their lessons. They keep coming back, every day, hoping for teachers and books again." She turned to me, and the hope in her eyes was warring with a sorrow so deep it was bottomless. "Will you stay?" she pleaded. "Will you teach them? They deserve to finish what they started, to learn all the things they were meant to before the accident." I wanted to ask. I needed to know what accident she meant, what tragedy had tethered her and these children to this place. But as I opened my mouth, she gave me one last, heartbreaking smile and began to walk down the hill, following the path her students had taken until she, too, vanished. That evening, when I returned the key to Robert Steinberg, my hands were still shaking. He took one look at my face, and his own expression turned grave. He invited me in for coffee, and there, by the warmth of his wood-burning stove, he told me the school's final, terrible secret. "Margaret Anderson," he began, his gaze lost in his coffee cup, "taught here from 52 to 67. Best teacher this town ever saw. She loved those kids like they were her own. Never married. Said the school was her family." He took a long, slow sip. "The accident, it happened in February of 67. A blizzard, the likes of which nobody had ever seen. The forecast was wrong. It caught everyone in a whiteout nightmare. Miss Anderson did the right thing, kept all the children at the school to wait it out." His voice cracked. "But the old furnace, it gave out during the night." He fell silent for a long moment. "When the storm broke the next morning, they went up to the school," he continued, his voice barely a whisper. "They found them all in the main classroom. She'd gathered them around the piano, probably singing songs to keep their spirits up. A faulty chimney had silently leaked carbon monoxide into the room. 23 children and their teacher, all of them gone. I stayed one more night in Chitina, sleeping fitfully in my small motel room. I couldn't bring myself to go near the schoolhouse again. The next morning, as I packed my car to leave, a sound carried on the crisp, cold air across the silent town. 3 short rings, followed by 2 long ones. A new day of school had begun. A day of lessons that would never, ever end. Some delivery manifests just feel wrong from the moment they land on your desk. This was one of them. An order for a town that, according to every map I had, hadn't existed for 100 years. Up here in Alaska, my job is basically to be a lifeline to nowhere. I'm Ryan, and I manage supply chains for a company called Northern Logistics. We get food, medicine, and fuel out to the folks living in the most cut-off corners of the state. It's tough work, where a bad weather forecast can turn a simple drop-off into a fight for your life. Most of our routes go to living, breathing communities. But this was for a place called LMR, a dot on the coast of Prince William Sound. LMR was a ghost town, a relic of a copper mining boom that went bust back in 1919. Yet, someone there had placed a massive order for winter survival gear. Canned foods, stacks of batteries, first aid kits, the works. The strangest part? It was all paid for up front. A cashier's check, clean as a whistle, that sailed right through the bank. But when I tried to call the customer to coordinate the drop, the line was dead. Just a flat, empty tone. Company rules are strict, though. If a delivery is paid for, you attempt it no matter what. So, I loaded up the truck and set my GPS for coordinates that pointed to a patch of abandoned coastline. The drive started on the Seward Highway, a familiar ribbon of asphalt heading south from Anchorage. But soon, the pavement gave way to smaller roads, which then dissolved into gravel tracks that looked like they hadn't been graded since the last ice age. The final leg of the journey was a narrow, winding path carved through a forest so dense it swallowed the daylight. The air grew still and heavy. When I finally broke through the trees, the view of Prince William Sound was breathtaking, but the town of Elamar was a skeleton. All I saw were crumbling foundations, scattered stone, and the rusted-out husks of mining equipment, monuments to a forgotten industry. The wind howled through the ruins, a lonely, mournful sound. Amidst all that decay, one structure stood stubbornly intact. It was a 2-story wooden building, its siding warped and grayed by a century of coastal storms. Faded, hand-painted letters above the porch read, "Elmar Company Store." My manifest confirmed it. This was the spot. It looked as dead as everything else, but in Alaska you learn not to judge a person's choice of home. I've met hermits who make a place like this look like a 5-star hotel. I pulled the truck up as close as I could and started hauling boxes onto my hand truck. The front door was shut tight, but when I gave it a shove, it swung inward with a long, groaning complaint. The moment I stepped inside, it was like stepping into a photograph. The air was thick with the scent of old cedar, dry paper, and dust so ancient it felt like a physical presence. It was a general store, perfectly preserved from the early 20th century. Wooden shelves lined the walls, holding goods under a thick coat of grime. There were bolts of faded fabric, strange hand tools, and cans with labels so old I couldn't even guess what was inside. Sunlight struggled through the filthy windows, illuminating swirling columns of dust motes. I started stacking the boxes near the long wooden counter, figuring I'd just leave a note since the place was obviously empty. That's when I heard it, clear as day. Footsteps from a back room. Then a calm, friendly voice called out, "Be with you in just a moment." A man walked out from behind the counter, wiping his hands on a leather apron. He looked to be in his 50s, with a tidy graying mustache that looked straight out of an old-timey portrait. He was wearing a crisp white shirt with those elastic armbands, suspenders, and dark trousers. What threw me was how immaculate he was. He looked like he'd just clocked in for his morning shift, not like someone squatting in a ruin. "You must be the delivery from Northern Logistics," he said, his smile warm and genuine. "I've been waiting on this shipment for quite some time. Hope the journey wasn't too much trouble." I was a bit taken aback. We'd only gotten the order 2 weeks ago, but I just chalked it up to the slow pace of life out here. I handed him the clipboard with the manifest. He scanned the list, nodding to himself. "Ah, perfect," he said, looking genuinely pleased. "My customers have been asking for these. I was getting worried I wouldn't be able to restock before the snows hit." I glanced around the silent, dusty store. Customers? What customers? But hey, it wasn't my place to ask. I helped him move the boxes behind the counter. He arranged them on the shelves with the smooth, practiced ease of a man who'd done this exact task 1,000 times before. Once we were done, he turned to an ornate, old-fashioned cash register, slid open the wooden drawer, and began counting out my payment. In cash. The bills were crisp, almost slick, as if they'd just come from the mint. But as he handed them over, I realized the designs were decades old. I'd seen enough vintage currency to recognize bills from the 40s and 50s. These looked like they'd been printed yesterday. "I truly appreciate you making the trip," he said, placing the money in my hand. "It's not an easy place to get to, Elmar. My patrons will be so relieved to see the shelves full again." As if he'd spoken them into existence, the front door creaked open again. A group of men and women shuffled in, carrying woven baskets. They were all dressed in the heavy, practical work clothes of the early 1900s, the men in worn overalls and flannel, the women in simple, long dresses. They looked like miners and their families, the very people who would have lived here during the town's heyday. They moved through the aisles with a quiet purpose, picking things off the shelves, their hushed conversations filling the space. They were solid, real, not ghostly apparitions, but their presence made the air feel heavy, charged with a strange static. A woman with tired eyes and a woolen shawl came to the counter with a few cans and a roll of fabric. Her voice, when she spoke, was thin, like sound traveling over a frozen lake, carrying a weird reverb that didn't belong in that small space. "Put this on the Murphy account if you would," she said. "John will be by to settle up on payday, same as always." The storekeeper just nodded, opened a huge, leather-bound ledger, and made a neat entry with a fountain pen. More people filed in, and soon the store was humming with a low, ghostly bustle. I just stood there, paralyzed, trying to process what I was seeing. My brain screamed that this had to be some kind of insane historical reenactment, but it was too real, too natural. These weren't actors. This was just their Tuesday. After a few minutes, the crowd began to thin out, leaving in small, quiet groups. The storekeeper came back over to me. "Thank you again," he said, extending his hand. I shook it. His grip was firm, but his skin was shockingly cold, like touching marble in the dead of winter. "Business has been picking up lately. I'll likely have another order for you in a couple of weeks." I drove away from LMR in a fog of total disbelief. The entire trip back to Anchorage, I kept reaching into my pocket to touch the cash. It was the only thing that felt real. The next day, I filed my delivery report as a success and left out every single bizarre detail. I took the cash to the bank, and the teller accepted the old, pristine bills without a second glance. Sure enough, 2 weeks later, another order for LMR came through. Another cashier's check that cleared instantly. When the manifest hit my desk, a cold dread washed over me. I told my boss I had to cover a different route and sent another driver out there. When he got back, his report was simple. The delivery went fine. But then he added, "Weird customer, though." The guy was dressed like he'd just stepped out of an old black and white movie. I've never gone back to LMR. I make sure any future deliveries to that address are handled by someone else. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that company store, standing alone in the Alaskan wilderness. And I wonder about a business that never closed, still serving customers who have been shopping there for more than 100 years, forever caught in a transaction that bridges the world of the living with whatever lies beyond. This photograph shouldn't exist. Look closely past the rust and the collapsed timber. See that chart on the wall? The numbers on it, detailing copper or production, are a perfect match for the historical records of a mining operation that shut down in the 1930s. I know because I'm the one who took the picture. The problem is, when I was standing there, that wall was bare, and the office it was in had been a ruin for almost a century. My name is Zoe Kim. For a living, I hunt ghosts, just not the kind you're thinking of. I'm a documentary photographer, and my specialty is capturing the soul of Alaska's abandoned places, the boomtowns that went bust, the lonely outposts swallowed by the wilderness. It's a job that's part historian, part artist, and part trespasser. You learn to read the stories left behind in peeling paint and broken glass. And sometimes, if you're quiet enough, the stories tell themselves. That's what led me to Lutch Island in the fall of 2023. Lutch is a name whispered among Alaskan historians. Tucked away in the icy waters of Prince William Sound, it was once the beating heart of a massive copper empire in the early 20th century. Imagine a bustling town of 1,500 people carved out of the raw frontier, all centered around a mine that pulled fortunes from the earth. Then, in the 30s, the copper ran dry. The company pulled out and the people followed. They say it happened almost overnight. They just dropped their tools, locked their doors, and sailed away, leaving behind one of the most perfectly preserved ghost towns in the state. Getting there was an ordeal in itself. It took a 2-hour charter boat ride across the choppy, slate-gray waters from Whittier. The captain, a grizzled man named Elias, agreed to drop me and my gear and come back the next evening. 36 hours all alone. It cost a small fortune, but Lutch is so isolated, so rarely documented. I knew it was the key to finishing a book I'd been working on for years. As Elias's boat pulled away, leaving me on the skeleton of a once mighty pier, the silence was deafening. The only sounds were the gentle slap of water against the shore and the lonely cry of a gull circling overhead. The air tasted of salt and wet stone. Before me, the ghost town sprawled across a wide, sloping bowl of land. Most of the smaller houses had been flattened by decades of heavy snow, their foundations like forgotten footprints. But the bigger structures still stood defiant. I could make out the timber frame ghost of the old company store and, looming over everything, the colossal skeletal remains of the copper processing mill. It climbed the hillside like the ribcage of some long-dead industrial beast. That was my target. I spent the first few hours just walking the grounds, letting the place speak to me, planning my shots. The low autumn sun was perfect, cutting through the ruins and casting long, dramatic shadows. It was in the heart of the mill, surrounded by a maze of silent machinery and rusted catwalks, that things started to get weird. I was framing a shot of the main processing floor, trying to capture the sheer scale of the decay, when I saw it. Just a flicker in the corner of my viewfinder. A shape that looked distinctly human, half hidden by a tangle of twisted steel. I lowered my camera, my heart giving a little kick. Nothing. Just empty space and the groaning of old metal in the wind. I figured it was a trick of the light, my eyes playing games on me. It happens. You're alone. In a creepy place, your imagination fills in the blanks. So, I lifted the camera again, squinting into the eyepiece to recompose the shot. And it was still there. But this time, it wasn't a flicker. It was a man. He was dressed in thick canvas trousers, a heavy wool shirt, and one of those old-fashioned miner's caps with a lamp on the front. He was just standing there. I could see the light filtering through his form, but through my lens, he was as solid as the rusted machinery around him. I snapped a few photos, my mind racing. Maybe it was some kind of lens flare or a weird optical illusion. But every time I looked away, he was gone, and every time I looked back through the camera, he was there. I started moving through the mill, my camera pressed to my face like a shield, and I began to see more of them. Miners, mill workers, all going about their business. One was turning a huge valve that hadn't moved in 90 years. A small group of them were gathered around a piece of equipment, their mouths moving in silent conversation. They were transparent, like old film projected onto the ruins, and only my camera could see them. They weren't scary. They weren't even aware of me. They were just at work. By late afternoon, I felt like I was walking through two versions of the mill at once. The silent, dead ruin I saw with my own eyes, and the bustling, living factory that existed only inside my camera. The most magnetic of all these figures was a woman. She was probably in her 30s, dressed in a long skirt and a crisp white blouse that told me she wasn't a laborer. She moved with a purpose that suggested she was in charge, carrying a clipboard and stopping to talk with the phantom workers. I switched to my telephoto lens, zeroing in on her. As I focused, she turned and looked straight down the barrel of my lens. Her expression wasn't fearful or angry. It was curious. Her eyes were so intelligent, so full of life, I completely forgot she was a ghost. For an hour, I became her shadow, documenting her spectral workday. She seemed to be doing an inspection, checking equipment, and making notes in a ledger she carried. At one point, she walked so close I could have reached out and touched her. She paused, looked right at me, or rather at my camera, and her lips moved. There was no sound, but in the magnified view of my lens, I could read them perfectly. She said, "Are you documenting our work?" I gave a short, involuntary nod. I knew she couldn't see me, not really, but she smiled, a small, knowing smile, and then she gestured with her head, beckoning me to follow. She led me to a section of the mill that had once housed the administrative offices. To my naked eye, it was a wreck of rotted wood and collapsed beams. But through my camera, it was a fully furnished, functioning office from the 1920s. People sat at desks, typing on invisible typewriters and sorting through stacks of phantom paperwork. The woman who led me there pointed to a large chart on the back wall, covered in figures and dates. I zoomed in. It was a production and shipping schedule, and the dates were all from 1927, the mine's most profitable year. She wanted me to see them at their peak, to understand the life that had once filled these empty spaces. As the sun dipped below the mountains, the light began to fail, and the figures in my camera started to fade. They grew fainter, more translucent, until they were just whispers of light in the growing dark. Then they were gone. The silence that rushed back in was heavier than before. I spent a long, cold night in my tent near the harbor, and the next morning the mill was just a mill. The ghosts were gone. Back in my studio in Anchorage, I held my breath as I loaded the memory cards. I was half convinced I'd imagined the whole thing. But as the images appeared on my screen, my jaw dropped. They were there. Faint, ethereal, but unmistakably there. Dozens of ghostly workers woven into the fabric of the ruins. The final proof was the picture from the office. There was the woman sitting at her desk. And behind her, on the wall, the production chart. Every number, every date was crystal clear. A quick search of the state's historical archives confirmed it. The figures in my photograph were an exact match for the mine's documented output in 1927. There was no way I could have known that. I've since included some of those photos in exhibitions. I never tell the real story, of course. People compliment the haunting atmosphere or ask what kind of digital layering I used. They don't realize they're looking at a literal documentary of the dead. That trip to Lutz changed everything. I now know my camera isn't just capturing light and shadow. It's capturing memory. I've been back to the island twice, hoping to see them again, but the mill has remained empty. Maybe it was a once-in-a-lifetime fluke, a moment when the veil between then and now wore thin enough for my lens to see through. Or maybe they only show themselves to someone who's willing to look for the stories, not just the ruins. The photos are my proof. They're proof that as long as a memory remains, no place is ever truly abandoned. Have you ever wondered what happens to a town when everyone just leaves? When the last person turns the key, walks away, and nature begins its slow, relentless reclamation. Someone has to stand guard over these silent places to make sure the dreams and the struggles that soaked into the very soil don't just fade into nothing. My name is Samuel Blackwood, and for the last 15 years, that's been my job. I work for the Alaska Heritage Foundation as a historical preservationist, which is a fancy way of saying I babysit ghost towns. It's a solitary life, sending me into the deepest, most remote corners of the wilderness for weeks, sometimes months, at a time. But the quiet never bothered me. I always felt that these abandoned places had stories gasping to be told, and I was there to listen. My assignment for the winter of 2023 was Iditarod, a name that echoes through Alaskan history. It was the original heart of the famous Dog Sled Trail, a town that exploded into existence in 1910 on the promise of gold. Prospectors flooded the remote interior, and in the blink of an eye, Iditarod was a bustling community of nearly 10,000 souls, complete with hotels, saloons, and general stores. It was one of Alaska's biggest inland settlements. But boomtowns have a nasty habit of going bust. When the easy gold ran out by the early 1920s, the town started to hemorrhage people. The final nail in the coffin was a catastrophic fire in 1929 that gutted the entire commercial district. Instead of rebuilding, people just packed up what little they had left and walked away, leaving Iditarod to the mercy of the brutal Alaskan climate. I was tasked with spending the entire winter there, from November to March, to survey what was left and figure out a plan to save the most important structures. Winter work is a different beast. The crushing weight of snow and the deep, penetrating cold have a way of exposing weaknesses you'd never spot in the summer. I'd been there before on short trips, but this was my first deep dive. My bush plane touched down on a frozen lake a couple of miles from the town site, leaving me with a mountain of supplies. A generator, fuel, for months of non-perishable food, and all my specialized equipment. My home base was a dilapidated 2-story building that once served as a boarding house for miners. It took some serious work to make it livable, patching the roof, installing a wood-burning stove, but it was a solid, secure shell against the wilderness. The first few weeks were peaceful, falling into a comfortable rhythm. The Alaskan winter sun gives you only a few precious hours of daylight, which I spent outside surveying. The long, dark evenings were for organizing my notes, cross-referencing my findings with old photographs and town records I'd brought along. The isolation was total, a profound silence that I've always found more comforting than lonely. Then, about 3 weeks in, I realized I wasn't as alone as I thought. It started with footprints in the fresh snow. Not mine. These tracks would appear overnight, meandering around the collapsed structures I was studying. They were made by old-fashioned work boots, the kind with distinctive heel and sole patterns you'd see in photos from the town's heyday a century ago. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe another researcher I hadn't been told about? A local from a distant village with a reason to be there? But when I tried to follow the tracks, they led to nowhere. They would walk straight into the middle of a caved-in building, stop at the very edge of a deep, snowy ravine, or just end abruptly. No sign of a person turning back, no other path away, just gone. Even more unnerving, I could distinguish at least 6 different sets of prints, suggesting a whole group of people was wandering the town site. I set up motion-activated cameras. I watched from my window during the slivers of daylight and saw nothing. Not a single living soul. Soon, other strange things began to happen. I'd secure the door to a building at the end of the day, only to return the next morning and find it standing wide open, creaking in the wind with no sign of a break-in. Tools I'd left meticulously organized on a workbench would be rearranged, not scattered, but set out neatly as if someone had been using them for a specific task and had just set them down for a moment. But the most unsettling part was the sounds. Through the long, black nights, I'd hear them. The clear, rhythmic tap-tap-tap of a hammer. The long, slow groan of a handsaw cutting through timber. The creak and groan of heavy beams being moved into place. It sounded like a full-blown construction crew was at work somewhere in the darkness. The sounds were too methodical, too purposeful to be the wind or the old buildings settling. They always seemed to drift from parts of town where I knew for a fact that nothing was left but foundations and rubble. One frigid December night, the sounds were louder than ever, and I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know. The temperature was pushing 40 below, a cold that feels like it's actively trying to kill you. But I bundled up in my heaviest gear, grabbed a high-powered flashlight, and stepped out into the crushing silence. I followed the ghostly hammering toward what used to be Iditarod's main street. The sounds led me to a large, excavated foundation, which my maps identified as the site of the town's grandest hotel, a 3-story building that had burned to the ground in the 1929 fire. All that was left was a crater full of charred stones and twisted metal. But the sounds of construction were undeniably coming from right there. As I crept closer and shined my flashlight beam into the pit, my brain simply refused to process what I was seeing. The hotel was being rebuilt. Not by living men, not with modern equipment, but by a crew of translucent figures. There were at least a dozen of them, all dressed in the simple work clothes of the early 20th century. I could see right through them to the frozen earth and rubble beneath their feet, yet they moved with purpose and weight. They were raising the timber frame of the hotel, their movements practiced and efficient, a silent ballet of experienced builders. They didn't speak, communicating only with nods and gestures, a team that had clearly worked together for a lifetime. I was frozen in place, watching this impossible spectacle, when one of them looked up. He was a man in his 40s, with a thick, dark beard and a face weathered by 1,000 brutal winters. He saw me standing there, a strange figure in modern gear with a beam of light, and our eyes met across the century that separated us. And he smiled, a simple, knowing smile. He gave me a slight tip of his worn cap, a gesture of quiet acknowledgement, and then turned right back to his work, as if my presence was the most natural thing in the world. I stood there for what felt like hours, a spectator at a supernatural construction site, snapping photos with my camera and scribbling frantic notes. The phantom crew worked without a pause, their ghostly forms gradually piecing together a building that hadn't existed for nearly 100 years. As the first faint hint of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, they began to fade. Their forms grew thinner, more transparent, until they dissolved completely into the morning twilight, leaving no trace of their night's labor. The hotel foundation was just as empty and ruined as it had been the day before. But everything for me had changed. I wasn't just a caretaker of ruins anymore. I was sharing my watch with the very spirits who had built this place, the ones who refused to let it die. For the rest of that winter, I continued to witness their work. Different crews of spirits appeared at different locations, each one meticulously rebuilding the specific hotel, or store, or cabin they had constructed in life. They only ever appeared at night, and only on the coldest ones, as if the extreme temperature was a bridge that allowed them to cross back into the physical world. I came to understand they weren't haunting Iditarod in the way we think of ghosts. They weren't trapped or tormented. They were simply continuing their life's work. They were the town's original preservationists, their pride and dedication so strong that not even death could make them stop. My final report to the Foundation covered all the necessary, conventional details about structural decay and preservation strategies. But I also attached a confidential addendum, detailing everything I had seen. I argued that Iditarod needed to be protected not just for its history, but as a living memorial, a place still actively inhabited by the indomitable spirits of its creators. The Foundation never officially commented on my supernatural findings, but they accepted my recommendations. And over the years, I've heard whispers from other caretakers who've spent time there, telling of similar experiences. I've been back to Iditarod many times since that first winter, always during the deep cold when the phantom crews are out. They know me now. They see me observing their work, and sometimes I get a nod or a gesture of recognition. We work in tandem, a silent partnership across time. They rebuild their town night after night, and I document its slow, physical decay by day. Together, we ensure that Iditarod and its stories will never be completely lost. The physical town will continue to crumble under the weight of snow and time, but it will never be truly abandoned. Not as long as its original builders are still on the job, raising their community from the ashes, one ghostly timber at a time. The map was a whisper from 1914, but its warning, scrawled in faded red ink, felt as urgent as a scream. Do not dig here after dark. I really should have listened. For me, weekends weren't for sleeping in. They were for sifting through the ghosts of Alaska's past, one beep of my metal detector at a time. My name's Ashley Martinez, I'm 33, and by day, I'm a geological survey technician for the state. That means labs, soil samples, and mineral reports. But come Saturday, I trade the lab coat for hiking boots and head for the wilderness. I'm a history junkie, and I love the thrill of pulling some long-forgotten artifact from the dirt, a tangible piece of the gold rush frenzy that once defined this land. Usually, my finds are pretty standard fare. Rusty nails, a few worn coins, maybe a piece of a shovel. Things people dropped and never thought about again. But then came the Chisana trip. This was back in August of 2023. Chisana is a special kind of ghost town, way out near the Canadian border. It was the last great North American gold rush, a flash in the pan that exploded in 1913 and was all but dead by 1916. At its height, almost 5,000 souls called that remote valley home. Now, it's just a scattering of skeletal cabins being swallowed by the wilderness, a place you can only reach by bush plane or a brutal overland trek. I was exploring the bones of an old miner's cabin, prodding at the collapsed floorboards, when my detector let out a sharp squeal. I dug down and hit a rusted-out coffee tin. Inside, nestled with a few gold coins and some brittle letters, was a hand-drawn map. It was beautiful. The creator, a man named Samuel Kowalski, had the steady hand of a surveyor. He detailed every creek and ridge with stunning precision, dating his work September 1914. The map was peppered with notes on gold deposits, little X's marking the spots where a man's fortune could be made. As a geologist and a historian, this was the jackpot, a primary source document from the peak of the Chisana rush. But my excitement cooled when I saw the notations around one specific creek drainage. They weren't in the neat black ink of the rest of the map. They were in a frantic, spidery red script. Strange sounds from underground. One read. Another said, Johnson and Miller disappeared October 15th. And then, underlined twice, avoid this area. My scientific brain immediately started trying to explain it away. Mining is dangerous work. Strange sounds could be settling earth or underground gas. Disappearances, while tragic, weren't unheard of. But I couldn't shake the feeling of a cold dread coiling in my gut. The geologist in me was fascinated by the potential mineralogy of that specific spot, but the rest of me felt a primal warning. Still, curiosity won. It always does. 2 weeks later, I was back. I chartered a flight and brought enough gear for a 3-day solo expedition. The late August weather was a gift, crisp, clear, and perfect for camping. The plan was simple. Hike the 5 miles to the creek indicated on Kowalski's map, set up a base camp, and spend 2 solid days seeing what secrets the ground was willing to give up. The hike itself was a beast, forcing me to bash through dense brush and scramble over scree slopes scarred by a century of mining. When I finally arrived, the valley was just as the map described. The ghosts of the gold rush were everywhere. Hand-dug pits pockmarking the landscape, the splintered remains of sluice boxes, and tools abandoned mid-swing. I found a sheltered spot in a grove of spruce to pitch my tent. The place was stunningly beautiful, but it was the silence that got to me. It was absolute. No birds, no squirrels, not even the buzz of insects. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky in fiery colors, that silence thickened, becoming heavy and oppressive. It felt like the entire valley was holding its breath. The next morning, I started my survey, sweeping my detector in systematic arcs along the creek bed. It didn't take long to get hits. I unearthed a few coins, some corroded tool heads, the usual stuff. But as the hours wore on, the finds started to get weird. I found clothes. Not a single lost sock, but whole shirts and trousers, buried deep in the gravel as if they'd been ripped from their owners. I found boots, several pairs, all showing signs they'd been frantically kicked off, not just left behind. Then came the personal effects, and that's when the real chill set in. Pocket watch, its hands frozen in time. A woman's wedding band. A tarnished silver locket containing a faded photo of a young family. These weren't discarded. They were dropped. Dropped in a moment of sheer terror. My detector shrieked over one spot, the signal deep and strong. I started digging, and about 3 feet down in what looked like an old prospector's test pit, my shovel struck something hard. It wasn't rock. It was bone. My geology work includes a bit of forensics, and I knew instantly these remains weren't natural. The bones were shattered and splintered, evidence of a violence so extreme it was hard to process. And there were so many. This wasn't a single accident. I was standing in a mass grave. I know what I should have done. I should have stopped right then, packed up, and called the state troopers. But my scientific mind, my need to know what happened, took over. I kept digging, carefully expanding the pit. More horrors emerged. Shredded fabric interwoven with bone fragments, tools snapped in half, and personal belongings scattered like confetti. The pattern suggested the bodies had been torn apart, and maybe even partially consumed. I uncovered the remains of at least 6 different people. For over 100 years, a massacre had laid hidden in this silent valley. The sun was setting, casting long, menacing shadows. When I finally straightened up, my body aching, my mind reeling. I was snapping photos of the site, planning to cover it with a tarp for the night, when I heard it. The sound Samuel Kowalski had warned of. It started as a low, deep rumbling that vibrated up through the soles of my boots, like an earthquake far below. But it wasn't geology. The rhythm was wrong. It grew into the distinct sound of digging, huge, powerful scraping and clawing, as if colossal machinery was chewing through the earth right beneath me. And between the digging sounds, there was breathing. A deep, wet, rhythmic inhale and exhale, the sound of immense lungs pulling in air. As true darkness fell, the sounds grew more frenzied. I could hear multiple things moving down there, their frantic excavation echoing from an unseen network of tunnels. I scrambled back to my tent, my heart hammering against my ribs. I tried to lie to myself, to rationalize it as shifting permafrost or escaping methane. But it was no use. The sounds were too deliberate, too horribly alive. Around midnight, I saw movement at the edge of my camp. Dark shapes were emerging from the very pit I had just dug. I flicked on my flashlight, its beam cutting a shaky path through the darkness. What I saw shattered every law of biology I had ever learned. They were vaguely humanoid, but grotesquely oversized, with impossibly long limbs that ended in shovel-like claws caked in mud and rock. Their skin was a sickly, pale white, so translucent I could see the dark, sluggish pulse of their internal organs. But their faces, dear God, their faces were the most terrifying part. They still held a ghost of human features, twisted and warped but recognizable. It was then that the full, soul-crushing horror of it hit me. These creatures weren't the killers of those miners from 1914. They were the miners, transformed by some unspeakable process, their humanity warped into something suited for an eternity in the dark. They paid me no mind. With a dreadful, coordinated purpose, they began to undo my work. They used their massive claws to scoop dirt and gravel back into the pit, gently, almost reverently, reburying the bones and artifacts I had so carelessly exposed. They were custodians, hiding the evidence of their own damnation. Then one of them stopped. It slowly turned its head, a motion full of cracking, unnatural sounds, and its pale, dead eyes found me cowering in the beam of my flashlight. I saw a flicker of something ancient in them. Not malice, but a profound, eternal sorrow. Its mouth, a mangled ruin, opened. A voice, like rocks grinding together, rasped out of its chest, the words a struggle. You should not have dug here. The voice was a distorted echo from a century past. It paused, and then added a final, chilling clarification. Some gold costs everything. I didn't sleep. I sat rigid in my tent until the first hint of dawn, listening to them toil. When the sun finally crested the ridge, the sounds were gone. I crept out of my tent. The valley was silent once more. The site of the grave was gone. The ground was perfectly smooth, as if it had never been disturbed. In a daze, I swept my detector over the area. Nothing. It was all gone. I broke camp in a frenzy, hiked back to Chisana in record time, and didn't start breathing properly until my charter plane was lifting off the ground. The only proof I have of that night is Samuel Kowalski's map, which I keep locked away. I never reported the grave. I never told anyone what I found. Some secrets demand to be kept. They have guardians who paid the ultimate price for their greed, now bound to an eternal vigil in the cold, dark earth, ensuring no one else ever uncovers the terrible cost of the gold they found.